Hi, everyone. Today is September 14th, Monday. I believe this is chapter 2 for American Government and Political Science. Probably the best written chapter in a textbook that I've come across in quite some time. And it's a free textbook. I know some of you are having a few glitches in trying to track it down. How do I actually get on there? Some of it's because I think you have a firewall on your computer and it's preventing you from actually accessing it. But for this class, again, it's OpenStax. That's sort of the organization through Rice University and other colleges that get together and try to put together free resources to help students save money on college expenses. It can be very expensive sometimes to purchase some of the textbooks that are required. Again, it's OpenStax. It's just basically, if you type in U.S. government OpenStax or OpenStax U.S. government, you'll come up with the text. Chapter 1, I wasn't crazy about. Chapter 2, I loved it. It is fantastic, not only in telling us why we broke away from Great Britain's rule, because it was more complex than just this concept of no taxation without representation. A lot of it was about local representation instead of virtual representation. We wanted representation coming from our own communities. And it was also because the British were trying to crack down after that 7 Years' War, also called the French and Indian War. They wanted to crack down because they needed to exert their influence over the colonies because of the Great War that they had. And they needed to get some money basically out of their nation, which was partly the American colonies. And the result was catastrophic. I mean, the reaction was so stunning that it really is amazing to me how the colonists reacted over, I think, initially some really minor taxation, and they revolted. And this class isn't a history class. It's about the U.S. government. But you need to understand the underpinnings of why we revolted to understand the philosophy of our political outlook. And a lot of it was based upon political philosophies of people like John Locke. And, of course, later on, the writings of Thomas Paine, really one writing of Thomas Paine called Common Sense. They were critical to the philosophy that we had that government not only should be a social contract between the governed people and the government, it must have basic recognition of fundamental rights that the government really can't interfere with unless they're very, very appropriate. There's a good cause shown, maybe to protect even greater rights to greater numbers, might we have an infringement of what we consider inalienable rights. That wasn't that uncommon in the British viewpoint. The difference was in the colonies, we didn't think we were getting treated under such a system where people back in England were. They had representation in the parliament. They had an Englishman's Bill of Rights that was applicable to them. They had the Magna Carta. We just didn't feel like we were getting a clean and a fair shake under that, and we wanted local representation. So the revolution takes place. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but we know after we revolt, we got to figure out some kind of government. And we didn't want centralized government. That's what we're repealing or rebelling against. We want something that's a little more diffused, and we want control locally. And therefore, we created a confederacy. In fact, if you really love history the way I do, I'm obviously a nerd about it, think about the Civil War that we get into 1860. What did the South call themselves? The Confederacy. They wanted to go back to that vision of states' rights being supreme in sort of an amalgamation of like-minded governments working together when necessary, but most of the time keeping local rule as paramount and most important. And that's how we started our country. So we break away from Great Britain. We're successful in a lengthy war, large part because England didn't put its whole backbone into it, but also we had the allegiance of the French, and we were fighting in our soil. There's a number of factors why we won, but we win. So we got to create some kind of government. And why do we have to create a government? Why can't we just let the states rule themselves? Is we need foreign aid. We need to be recognized by foreign governments as legitimate. We need to be able to create credit. We have to have some kind of identity in order to sign a peace treaty with Great Britain and have France participate as well. We need to be a nation. So what's going to be a framework of government? And the book, I thought, did a fantastic job saying the Articles of Confederation delivered for a little while. And this was this loose amalgamation of basically 13 countries. The 13 colonies had independent authority. And the only thing that was surrendered to the central authority was basically by consent. And you needed 9 members of the 13 states to really get any action done. Pretty significant. But to amend the Articles of Confederation, you needed all 13 states to agree, which is Try to get everyone to agree on something. Just thinking of my own house here, if we decide to get takeout, if everyone had to agree to it, no one's getting takeout. Just go to some kind of majority rule or something like that, or we will have lockjam. And that's what they had. They couldn't get anything done, and they recognized early on the Articles of Confederation. You couldn't tax directly the people. You couldn't tax the states. You could ask the states for contribution based upon their wealth. Very few complied, and it created a bit of chaos. Initially, it wasn't so terrible, actually. We're recognized by foreign governments. Things are going okay, but as we grew and became more prosperous, other parts of the population didn't, and many of them were people that were unpaid as a result of contributing during the Revolutionary War. That we didn't have money for it, the federal government, to pay these war debts, and so these farmers were indebted. They're bankrupt. They're losing their farms. They're going to debtor's prison, and they're saying, "But the federal government, you owe us money. We've had enough. We're going to rebel within our own state." And states didn't have the power to quash a rebellion, and that's the famous one right here in Massachusetts. Much of constitutional history and American history can be found right here in the state of Massachusetts. Shays' Rebellion happened right out in Western Mass, where I grew up, and it actually culminated, or ended, if you will, when they tried to take over the Springfield Armory, where Springfield Technical Community College is housed. It's on the same campus as the Springfield Armory, and it finally collapsed. So we're into this Articles of Confederation for 7 or 8 years. It's not doing so great. It can't regulate commerce between the states. Each state is coining its own money. States are creating tariffs between states. States are creating their own tariffs with foreign nations. It's kind of getting chaotic, and it doesn't work. There's no centralized authority. It's just basically 13 independent states, sometimes almost nearly at war with one another. Chaos ensues. We've got some pretty good leaders in our nation that recognize we're in trouble. We got to act. We got to do something. So they initially meet at Annapolis, and that doesn't work. All 13 states were invited, 5 showed up, but James Madison was there, Hamilton was there, and other people that didn't come recognized they probably should have, but they proposed the next one, and that's it's been named the Constitutional Convention of 1787 in Philadelphia. So it's roughly, we've got 9 years under the Articles of Confederation, and it's getting to be a dangerous time. We're worried about foreign invasion. We're worried about collapsing as a nation. We're worried about states going to war with one another. Are we going to survive, or aren't we? What are we going to do? And so they met down in Philadelphia. A lot of people thought this was a revolution within a revolution. In fact, there's a really good book written called The American Revolutions, because there's one breaking away from England, but then there's arguably a second one when we basically overthrow or throw out the Articles of Confederation to adopt the new Constitution. But it's not really an overthrow, because it's with the consent of the people. Not so much the meeting in Philadelphia, but once they come up with a proposal in Philadelphia, they're going to send it back to the states to be approved, not by the state legislatures. This is actually ingenious, but by a special convocation or convention of on the constitutional adoption, and it would be made up of people from all over. Each state would be sent to their state capital, not in the legislature, but to vote specifically up or down on the adoption of the Constitution, really democratizing its adoption. And what are we showing there? We're showing that power doesn't come from a sovereign king, or it doesn't come from an oligarchy or this huge powerful group. It comes from the people. The people are going to rule by consent, and they're going to be the ones picking and determining whether or not the Constitution is viable. So I know this isn't a history class, but you can't help but marvel at what they did down in Philadelphia, saying, we got to come up with something. I'll talk about the New Jersey plan first. There, it would have still kept states' rights as most significant, but it would have gave the federal government, the central government, the power to tax and to regulate commerce, which is kind of the biggest 2 pitfalls many people saw in the Articles of Confederation. But a majority of the people down in Philadelphia recognized the Articles of Confederation were just not working. Most history books and most historians and most professors make it sound like the Articles of Confederation were just a complete nightmare. It wouldn't have been if things were going well, but it's like one of those things that don't work well when you do need a strong central arm to basically create a situation where there's not civil disobedience and some of the freedoms have to be curtailed for the common good. You need a strong central government, and they didn't see it in the Articles of Confederation. They didn't think there was enough in the New Jersey plan to adopt it. The second one, which was a well thought out plan by mostly, they call it the Virginia plan because it came from James Madison. Little glitch of history or oddity of history. Everyone talks about, our own John Adams and Thomas Jefferson down in Virginia participating. They were both in foreign nations during the time of the drafting of our U.S. Constitution. Not that their sentiments weren't important, but they weren't even here. They did not sign the the United States Constitution. Declaration of Independence, that was different. That's 1776. Now we're into 1787 and then ultimately adopted in 1789. This article, the new Constitution, came about as a result of many leaders, but one of the most important, he's considered the author of the Constitution, kind of a bit of a stretch to say he's the author because many people participated, and that's James Madison of Virginia. And that's why it's called the Virginia Plan. He comes up with the Virginia Plan. Here is going to be a strong central government. States would really take a backseat. They'd have some authority, but very limited. The legislature would be determined solely on the size of a state. He thought it was a great idea, and many people did, but it wasn't going to fly. Small states, Delaware, New Jersey, Maryland, well, Rhode Island didn't even participate. Only 12 states came down to the Constitutional Convention of Philadelphia. And Rhode Island's always a stick in the mud, so we're not participating. In fact, the last one to agree to adopt it once it becomes sent out for approval. It took 12 other colonies to kind of convince them it's a good idea, even though it only took 9 to ratify. But anyways, they're down there. James Madison comes up, so we've got one plan, a Jersey plan, kind of strengthen the Articles of Confederation. Ain't going to work. Not enough support. James Madison, being a very, very calculating political person, very, very smart, very, very thoughtful as a lawyer. Not that lawyers are always thoughtful, but I mean, he just was really good at what he did. Kind of mousy, but he didn't have a lot of personality in terms of convincing other people. But the concept of a strong centralized government, giving a legislative branch probably the most power, having a judiciary, having an executive, and there'd be checks between them. Many of the checks that we ultimately do adopt in our Constitution. But the problem is small states are saying, wait a minute, if the representation in the legislature, which we thought of as the most important branch in our tripart government, is going to really diminish these states that have all this independent sovereignty right now. Why would we give up so much power? We're going to let, at that time, the biggest states, New York, Virginia, Massachusetts, not too far behind, even though geographically it's a smaller state, pretty big population. They're like, no way. Why would we do that? It's like we're just giving up. So they had to come up with a compromise, and it's called the Great Compromise. And it's Roger Sherman right down here in Connecticut. Well, I'm right on the Connecticut border. You guys aren't, most of you. Roger Sherman of Connecticut came up with the Great Compromise. It adopts much of the Virginia Plan. How it compromises on it is saying, okay, we're going to have a legislature, but the legislature is going to be a hybrid. We're going to have a bicameral legislation. Bicameral means that there are 2 branches within one body. One will be the House of Representatives. That will be representative, a Republican form of government, based upon the population of your state. The greater the population, the greater number of members of your House of Representatives that you'll get for legislation. So large states like Virginia will have a lot of Congress people in the House of Representatives. Small states like Maryland and Rhode Island will get very tiny representation. Kind of irritating to the small states. Big states are fat and happy. They're great with it. Small states are going to balk, right? So what's the compromise? In the United States Senate, sometimes called the upper house, every state will have 2 senators, thereby making small states feel a certain degree of egalitarian or equity or equal with the larger states. Here's what a lot of people didn't realize is the Senate, because we're going to think of them as the more aristocratic body, the more likely to be landowning and wealthy, would be not selected by the people directly. This is one of the buffers in pure democracy that we have. It would be selected by state legislatures. Your state legislature will send your U.S. senators to, well, not then Washington, D.C., but later Washington, D.C., to become senators. And they would serve a 6-year term. It would be a more stable body. It wouldn't be up for election every 2 years like the House of Representatives. And that's called the Great Compromise. And so it looks like it's going to pass, but there's going to be some other compromises there that are important to know. We're going to talk about it distinctly later. I don't know if it's in this class, but it's certainly going to be, it should be talked a lot about in this class. I just don't know where we're going to do it appropriately. We have to talk about slavery. Now, slavery was dealt with at the convention. And unlike what the book suggests, it wasn't dealt with so much in the sense that some people wanted to ban it and others wanted to protect it as an institution so it wouldn't get dissolved. It was more about what role slaves would play in terms of being counted in representation. It wasn't that anybody was valuing their life in some way, though some would be willing to do so. Some would be willing to say we should free these people. They're individuals, they're human beings, and they should have equal right to freedom as any other person. Others were calculating that they weren't people at all, they were property. But that's not really what the debate was about. The debate was when we're going to have members sent to the House of Representatives. How do we count them? Would they be counted in the census like every other person would be in every other state, or would they be not counted at all because they're property? The North wanted to keep a balance of power. Slavery was pretty much ending or ended completely in the Northeast. They're saying we don't want slaves to be counted. That would be fundamentally unfair. That weakens our position in Congress, strengthens the South, and yet these people aren't treated as people at all. They're treated as property. What a hypocrisy. It's totally inappropriate. South says, okay, we're walking. We're not going to have a country. We're going to have 13 independent countries, and we're going to have all kinds of infighting, and we're probably going to collapse and maybe be taken over by some other country, if not Great Britain itself again. So a compromise had to happen. And this is one of these great debates in history. Do you compromise on huge, major values in order to get a half a loaf or a couple slices of bread than no bread at all? And that's a tough debate. And I know I dabble in thinking about getting into politics sometimes. And sometimes you want to accomplish something for your citizens, but you might have to compromise on something else that you either don't believe in or you think is kind of inappropriate. But how do you make any progress at all sometimes without making compromises? And that's the rub, the difficulty in this thing. So the compromise there was they said people in bond, they didn't say all other persons, that's what they called it. It's code for slaves. Slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person, not for their value, not for whether they're as human or as good or anything like that. It's just that when we do the population, every time you have 5 people in bondage, every time you have 5 African slaves, they would add up to 3 votes in terms of population representation. That's all it meant. And that was another compromise. Were there other compromises? Yeah, there's a huge one no one seems to want to talk about. And that is how much power would be given to the federal government versus how much would be reserved to the states. And that is the enumeration clause of Article 1. When you read the Constitution, you should. Many people never read the Constitution. Even people that think of themselves as kind of constitutional experts learn about the Constitution from reading textbooks and you read case law, but they don't actually read the body of the Constitution. You should. In the body of Constitution, it clearly lists the enumerated powers of Congress because many states are like, I'm scared to have a centralized government. Might not even be located close to my home. I'm living down in Georgia, and I'm going to give up power to a centralized government that might be seated in New York or Philadelphia or Washington, D.C., because that was early on the debated areas where it might end up. I don't want to give too much power to it. And we didn't. We reserved, at least at its inception, a significant degree of authority to legislate and police and do all the kinds of things that government need to do to the states. The federal government is a government of limited powers, arguably narrow at its inception. And it's listed in Article 1 if you're curious about it. And it's important things that were failures under the Articles of Confederation. The power to tax, the power to solely coin money. States are now going to be barred from that. The power to determine immigration rights and naturalization principles. The raising of navies and armies. To control tariffs with foreign nations. You're going to have 13 different tariff systems. So regulating commerce. All the important, what we think of as national things under these listed enumerated powers were going to be given to the federal government. The states might have some concurrent powers to do some of the same things, but some would be exclusively given to the federal government. If there was ever a conflict, if the federal government had a power, we know under the Supremacy Clause in the Constitution, the state would have to give way, and the law of the state would be either null or void as being in violation of the Federal Supremacy Clause. So this great compromise was done, and I'm going to put a film up on the link through YouTube, which is excellent stuff by great constitutional and historians. It's one of the better ones done, but they make it sound like after they leave Philadelphia, they vote on it. Not everyone agreed. I think 55 delegates came from the different states, 70 some odd were invited, but of those 55, several voted no. I don't think the Constitution, as you guys are proposing, is a great idea. William Randolph, for example, I think from Virginia, said, I'm not voting for this. There's no Bill of Rights. We need some protections to make sure these unalienable rights that we think of as so critical should be embodied in that doctrine. People like James Madison said, you don't need a Bill of Rights because the powers we're giving the federal government will be unlikely to ever travail or injure those individual rights. And states have individual Bill of Rights in their state constitutions, so they shouldn't have any worry. And so they leave there with a recommendation, a majority, a big majority say, yeah, let's adopt this. And in most books and most videos, I say, okay, now we have a new constitution, we all celebrate. That's not true at all. It's sent back to each of the states to be voted on, not by the state legislatures, because if the state legislatures were given the vote, this part's not talked about too much politically, but states are going to vote on a document that is going to take away some of the power to give it to a central government, talk about something that's going to be probably shot down. They gave it to the people of each state to create constitutional conventions, and these people, most people, white males that owned even slight amounts of property, would be eligible to serve in those constitutional conventions, and it would go to each state to be voted on. Some states that really liked it, some of the smaller states thought it was a great idea. They voted very quickly on it and approved it. The real linchpin, and again, this isn't talked about too much in the book, was Massachusetts. Massachusetts was on the fence, and we had two groups: the Federalists, those that were in favor of adopting this new constitutional scheme, and the Anti-Federalists. Terrible name to take for a cause. When you're anti something, it just doesn't have that political ring of bandwagon jumping. I want to jump on the anti something. But the Federalists were made up of, not always, but more likely to be the wealthy, the educated, those who had a large stake in society, and they were able to sell it quite well. And how did they sell it? Something called the Federalist Papers and other propaganda schemes. They went out and wrote articles called the Federalist Papers under, I think it was E Pluribus Unum. They had a couple of different Latin surnames, Brutus, a few others, and they would write, because they didn't want to give out their real name. It was Hamilton, John Jay. Adams wrote some of them. I'm trying to think of all the different writers of them, but Hamilton was Madison obviously was a great, Madison. The big three are Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay, and they wrote these articles talking about, hey, this Constitution is fantastic. The Anti-Federalists were saying, wait a minute, giving up too much central power is going to be an unwielding government. We're going to be under a new, maybe not be a king or a Parliament of England, but we're going to have our own, loss of liberty under this new centralized, powerful government that's not even going to be close to home. They didn't have as much money. They were more likely to be middling class, if you will. They're more likely to be farmers and artisans. Many of them educated, but they just didn't have the ability to sell their position nearly as well as the Federalists did. But it was a close call. Massachusetts, I forgot the specific number. I'd look it up on my phone right now, but I got to zoom in a second, so I want to make sure I get this done. But it literally came in within 5%, meaning approval was very close call. In fact, there's people writing back and forth on the eve of the vote here in Massachusetts that looks like the Constitution is going to be rejected in Massachusetts. And don't forget, two other huge states didn't vote yet, and that was Virginia and New York. And everyone said, whatever Massachusetts does, so will go the nation. Again, we played a very important part in American history. In Massachusetts, it passed it. One of the persons that was going to vote against it was Sam Adams, the beer maker. And I don't think it's that great a beer, to be honest with you. Everyone loves it. I think it's brewed with water on a Boston. It's crazy. But Sam Adams was one of our revolutionary leaders, and he was a very big political. He was John Adams, a cousin. And Sam Adams initially was against because he didn't have a Bill of Rights. And part of the way they sold it to convert people that were on the fence was they promised a Bill of Rights. I don't know how you do it. It's kind of like, yeah, buy the car and I'll give you new tires after the deal is done. Trust me, I'll do it. I find it incredible that a lot of people were swayed, because back then there was a lot of virtue in these political leaders that said, hey, after we pass this framework of government, we'll add a Bill of Rights within a couple of years. And they did. And so that sold a lot of people. So Massachusetts adopted it. I don't know what the next state was, but I think they needed one or two more, and it got, so we need 9, 9 out of 13. Once they had a 9, but Virginia and New York, it still was important for them to approve it because they were so large in the game, so to speak, that they needed to approve it, and they ultimately do. All the states eventually approve it. Rhode Island, again, being the last. I think New Hampshire had a couple of failed runs at it, meaning they rejected it initially before they actually voted for it. But the last to ultimately join our system of government was Rhode Island. Now, that's interesting. That took a long time. 24 minutes I'm into a video. Most people don't want to watch it any more than 5 minutes. I get it. Break it down into parts. The book is excellent. Read it a couple of times if it's not being absorbed. But what does it create? It creates checks and balances. And one thing I don't like this book or what any other book does, it does talk about what the legislature's role is. They're to pass laws. And the framers did intend the legislature, in essence, to be the most significant branch of government. There's no question about it. That was the intent. And I don't know why, but I read everywhere and I hear politicians, I hear highly educated people say, we have 3 equal branches of government. I'll fight to the day I die like I'm in a war. I disagree with that. That's not the intent. The legislature was the body that makes law. It was considered to be the most salient, most important, most representative branch of government. It's just fact. Maybe it isn't as much so as it once was, but that's what the intent was. They weren't supposed to be co-equal. They were supposed to have spheres of jurisdictional power, and there would be checks and balances between the 3 branches. but not so much at our inception. There was checks between the president and the legislature, and those you should know. You know the legislature tries to create laws, but what can the president do? They can veto those laws if the president thinks it's inappropriate, imprudent. But if the president's out of control or really blocking important legislation that the people really think needs to be passed, they put a mechanism, another part of the checks and balances. The legislature can override the president if 2/3 of both the House and the Senate agree that the law should be passed. They override the president. The other checks and balances built in there is it's just hard to get things through the legislature because you have a lower house and an upper house. The Senate and House of Representatives have to agree on a bill. Either the Senate can start a bill or the House can, but they both ultimately have to agree on what it is in order to get approved. That is inherently a check and balance just built within that branch. The only time a bill has to start in the House of Representatives is any kind of bill that relates to taxation. Otherwise, it can start in the Senate or the House. You don't need to know that technical rule yet, and probably should at some point. But a lot of people say, well, what other checks are there? Well, there's also funding. The president might have a goal, might want to do something, might want to engage in some kind of war, but you need the consent of Congress to go to war. The president might be able to engage troops in initial conflict, but the legislature can hold back funding because that's where the money comes from. There's many, and I'm not going to spend that much time on it because this is a little video lecture and I'm trying to hold your attention. There's several checks and balances between the legislature and the president. Think about it. The president also appoints all the executive members, people like the attorney general, the heads of all the administrative agencies, the courts. They're all picked by the president. Without a check? No, a huge check. They have to get the consent of the Senate for his or her. It's been all him for now, but at some point we'll probably have a female president down the road. You have to get the consent of the Senate for any of those approvals. And again, the veto power against the legislature is huge. And the president implements laws. He or she might find certain laws to be disfavorable and lead them to fall into dissuaditude. So there's a lot of checks and balances between the president and the legislature and the president. But a lot of people think, well, what about the courts? And everyone cites the fact that a court can look at a presidential action or the action of the legislature and rule it unconstitutional and therefore give it a nullity. Huge check, right? The problem with that is it didn't exist in our framers' mind, I don't think. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the court has the power to do that. It all stems, and I'm going to talk about it in a later lecture when we get to the courts, from an 1803 case called Marbury versus Madison, where the Supreme Court under Justice Marshall, greatest judge we ever had in the history of our country, maybe the greatest political leader we ever had in our country's history, basically said the court role is to interpret law, and the Constitution is a law. So therefore, when we interpret the Constitution, we give it meaning, and we are the final arbiters on what it means. So if we're going to rule something is unconstitutional in terms of presidential action or in terms of legislation action, it has the power to nullify their actions, and that's huge. And that's the huge check the court has on the legislature and the president. Well, what check do we have on the court? The court can just run amok, right? No. The president picks the members of the federal judiciary with the consent of the Senate. So there's an inherent check on there. And what a lot of people don't talk about is the Congress is also given the power to control the jurisdiction on what kind of cases the federal courts can hear, thereby limiting their authority as well. But we like to keep the courts, a lot of people say, well, the courts aren't a political body. Yes, they are. They're hugely political. But we want them to be the least influenced by political winds and political opinion and political meanderings. So we tend to want them, and it's in the Constitution, to appoint members to the judiciary for life as long as they don't get impeached. There is a mechanism there. There's a check and balance. And that's the other check on the president, by the way. We can toss him out of office if we want to impeach him. And that requires that the House bring charges by majority vote against the president, but they have to convict. And here's the check on the legislature for acting too quickly. The Senate has to convict by a 2/3 margin, which is very difficult to get. And we've had now 3 presidents who have been impeached, which just simply means charged, and that is Andrew Johnson after Lincoln. We had Bill Clinton, and now we've had Donald Trump, have all been impeached, which means simply charged by the House of Representatives. None of them have been convicted. We've never had a president removed by impeachment. Somebody goes, what about Richard Nixon? No, he thought he was probably going to be impeached and convicted, so he resigned. And it's kind of like, I've never been fired from a job, but sometimes I think things aren't going so well, so I give my 2 weeks notice. And so have you probably experienced that in life, breaking up in a relationship, right? I said she's going to dump me, so I'll dump her first so I feel better about things. So there's all kinds of checks and balances. Book does a nice job. I'm going to put up other videos on it, but it's over 30 minutes. Let me just keep you with two last thoughts. There's also things of recognizing that because it is a social contract, this John Locke principle, although Thomas Jefferson put in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because it sounds a lot better than life, liberty, and the protection of property. That was the underlying visualization of the philosophy of our country. We'll have life, liberty, but also we able to gain property and possess it, and the government will protect that interest from challenges from other people, and we'll be able to hold on to our things unfettered. That's an important principle in a democracy. So when we think about this structure, it's a social contract between the governed and the government. And part of that social contract is if things aren't working, the people don't have a right to rebel, but the people have the right to vote new people in the legislature, a new president every 4 years, potentially, and we have a right to change the actual framework of government if we don't think it's working. And we have an amendment process. I'll just leave you with the amendment process. How do we amend the Constitution? There's two different tracks. They're very similar. One is the Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. 2/3 of both branches have to agree on a proposed amendment to the United States Constitution. Then 3/4 of the states have to adopt that proposal. Very rare. Both methods are very rare. The second method sounds very similar, but it's slightly different. The states, 2/3 of the states basically propose an amendment through the legislature. Then the legislature disseminates that to the states for voting in 3/4. It's always 3/4 of the state have to agree to adoption of a constitutional amendment. How many amendments do we have? Personally, I think it's 17, but it's 27 if you want to get technical. But the first 10 came as a package, the Bill of Rights. We knew those were coming, or at least they were promised. But we've only amended the Constitution 17 other times. And some of them, I don't want to say for trivial reasons, but not for substantive rights for individuals. One was to fix the Electoral College because Thomas Jefferson tied with Aaron Burr. And even though Aaron Burr was implicitly running for vice president, there was no clear mechanism to distinguish between the presidential candidate for getting electoral college votes and the vice president, and that's the 11th or the 12th amendment, I'm not sure. But there's other amendments dealing with alcohol, about payment of members of government offices not being raised during the time of office if it has to do with emoluments. But most of them are substantive, and we don't like to mess around with the thing. We think we do. Every so often, we need a constitutional amendment saying marriage is between one man and one woman. We need a constitutional amendment to preserve the sanctity of a flag and make it unconstitutional to destroy or burn. And there's all this momentum after these different periods of time in our history, and then what happens to it? It tends to subside because it's such a difficult process. So the framers wanted to be able to be changed, but you had to really want to change it in terms of a very strong push over time with, I don't want to say universal support, but significant support for it to actually occur. But there's a safety valve in there. A lot of my friends, not my friends, but yeah, I guess they're my friends. Every so often, friends, we got to have a revolution. We got to change the country. And this is not working. And I say, we have a revolution. It's the power to vote. It's the power to amend the Constitution. You don't need to do it through violence or subterfuge. There's an inherent built-in, but we have to do what? We have to get a significant majority of the people to actually do it. It can't be the minority ruling the majority. It has to be the majority ruling the entire nation with protections for the minority groups. And I don't mean minority in terms of ethnic or race or color. I'm talking about minority in terms of viewpoint or philosophy. I went on and on and on, but this chapter is freaking fantastic. It's the best, well-written, and it's not that long, but there's a lot of information. So I do urge you to reread it from time to time if it doesn't set in. I'm actually going to post this, maybe this video too, but I'm actually going to post chapter 2 from this book in the U.S. Constitutional History class if you're in that, because it overlaps so well with the birth of our nation. Otherwise, be well. Don't be afraid to ask questions. I'm sure I left important things out because I do these things kind of off the cuff, just like I would in the classroom, but usually get to ask questions live in that moment. Don't be afraid to reach out. Thanks.